The sky over the Nile had begun its transition into a soft, bruised copper, the kind of light that seems to hold the warmth of the day even as the heat begins to lift from the earth. And to the west, the limestone cliffs of the desert were burning with a final, radiant gold. These massive geological formations, which have stood as silent witnesses to the rise and fall of dynasties, seemed to pulse with an internal heat, their craggy faces softened by the distance and the thick, hazy veil of wood smoke drifting up from the valley floor where the mud-brick villagers were preparing for the evening meal. Standing on the riverbank, the transition from land to water felt physical and immediate. The air here was noticeably cooler, heavy with the scent of crushed papyrus, damp silt, and the green, vegetal fragrance of the irrigation canals that crisscrossed the black land of the Kemet, like a network of life-giving veins. The river itself was a broad, steady presence, its surface moving with a heavy, purposeful grace, reflecting the sky like a sheet of brushed metal that rippled only where the current met the thickets of tor, green reeds, and the flowering heads of lotus plants that swayed in the wake of passing waterfowl. Just ahead, moored gently against a small wooden pier of sun-bleached timber, the river vessel waited, a craft of fine cedar and sycamore wood with a hull low and wide, designed specifically to navigate the shifting sands and hidden bars of the riverbed with ease, stepping from the packed, sun-cracked earth off the bank onto the wooden deck. The first sensation was the texture of the grain against bare feet smooth in places from years of use, but with a slight, reassuring grip where the natural oils of the wood had weathered under the relentless Egyptian sun. The boat shifted almost imperceptibly under the weight of a footfall, a slow, rhythmic dip that felt more like a heartbeat than a mechanical movement, echoing the ancient pulse of the water beneath. All around, the sounds of the evening were settling into a quiet, predictable cadence as the light deepened from gold to a dusty rose. Somewhere nearby, the crew was working with practiced, hushed efficiency, their movements as fluid as the river itself. One could hear the rhythmic thud of a heavy rope made of twisted palm fiber being coiled against the deck and the soft, rasping friction of linen as the sail was prepared for the morning's breeze, though for now the fabric hung loose and heavy in the still air. A simple canopy of bleached heavy weave linen was stretched over the central part of the deck, supported by slender wooden poles that hummed ever so slightly when a stray breeze caught the fabric, creating a sanctuary of shade that still held the scent of the day's heat. Beneath this shade, the air felt private and still, a small world of organic textures and historical echoes. The ship was a treasury of sensory details, red baskets stacked neatly near the stern, filled with flatbread, dried figs, and bundles of green onions, and large, rounded clay jars secured near the base of the mast with thick cords. These jars, cool to the touch and slightly porous, were sealed with mud bungs and held the water of the river, allowed to settle until it was clear and sweet, the terracotta sweating slightly in the evening air, looking back toward the shore. The world of the new kingdom was beginning its evening ritual in a way that had remained unchanged for generations. In the distance, the silhouettes of farmers could be seen walking slowly along the embankments, their bronze tools slung over their shoulders and their white kilts, stained with the dark mud of the fields as they returned to their homes. White ibises took flight in long, elegant lines, their wings catching the last of the light and turning them into flickers of fire as they crossed the river toward their nesting grounds in the thick marshes of the delta. Across the bank, the towering columns of a sandstone temple rose above the palm groves, their painted capitals reflecting the fading orange glow and the first hints of purple. standing as silent, stone sentinels to the gods who oversaw the rising and falling of the floods. Small plumes of smoke began to rise from the hearths of nearby homes, smelling of dried dung fires, chaff, and baking emmer grain, blending with the pervasive, sweet scent of the river water. The boat began to stir as the moorings were finally loosened by hands that knew every knot and fray of the rope. There was no sudden jolt or jarring movement, only a gradual, almost dreamlike realization that the gap between the dark wood of the hull and the black earth of the bank was widening. The crew used long, heavy poles of smoothed sycamore to push away from the silty bank. The sound of the water gurgling softly and rhythmically against the wood as the vessel found the main current of the stream. Now the river truly took over, its power subtle but absolute. The shore began to recede, the voices of the village and the occasional bark of a dog becoming a faint, melodic murmur that blended with the constant, dry rustle of the wind through the tall grasses. The boat glided into the open water, its movement so steady and smooth it felt as though the land were drifting away into the past rather than the boat moving forward into the future. The center of the Nile was a place of profound peace, where the water ran deep and the air was thick with the humidity of the life-giving stream, a moisture that settled on the skin like a cool silk veil. On deck, the shadows grew longer and more complex, stretching across the planks and over the woven grass mats laid out for rest, catching the intricate joinery where the cedar planks were lashed together with linen webbing. The copper sky was deepening into a bruised violet, and the golden light on the western cliffs had faded into a soft, ghostly grey that made the stone look like velvet. The world was narrowing down to the ship, the water, and the vast overhead expanse of the heavens. The irrigation canals, which had sparkled like silver threads only moments ago, were now lost in the gathering dusk, merged back into the dark silhouette of the valley floor. The heat of the day had finally retreated into the sand, replaced by a cool, refreshing breath that smelled of the open water and the distant, salt-tinged air of the great green sea far to the north. As the boat moved further into the channel, the rhythmic lap of the waves against the bow became the primary sound, a steady, hypnotic pulse that seemed to match the deliberate pace of the stars as they began to reveal themselves. The first of these stars, Sothis, the great bringer of the flood, began to prick through the deepening indigo of the eastern horizon, a faint, shimmering point of light that had guided travelers and priests through this valley for thousands of years. The great river stretched out ahead, a dark, shimmering road winding through the heart of the kingdom, silent and eternal under the gaze of the celestial bodies. High above, the sky turned a true, deep velvet, and the silhouette of the mast reached up toward the first constellations, swaying almost imperceptibly against the emerging lights of the night as the vessel found the heart of the current. The water hissed softly against the cedar planks, a sound like fine sand falling through a glass, while the scent of the cooling desert air mixed with the lingering sweetness of the river plants and the faint, resinous smell of the boat's own timber. To the east, the horizon had completely surrendered its color, becoming a solid, protective wall of navy blue, while the very last of the sun's influence lingered as a thin, translucent line of teal in the extreme west, marking the gateway to the Duort. Every few moments, the gentle, resonant creak of the rudder being adjusted by the steersman provided a grounded, rhythmic reminder of the journey's slow and steady progress. The crew had settled now, their white linen garments appearing as pale, flickering ghosts in the growing starlight, moving with a quietude that respected the immense, heavy silence of the river night. One could hear the distant, lonely call of a jackal from the rocky high ground, a sharp sound that only served to emphasize the safety and enclosure of the wooden deck and the companionship of the water. The clay jars near the mast stood as solid, comforting shapes in the gloom, their surfaces damp with the thick condensation of the evening air. The transition into the deep night was seamless, a slow immersion into a world where time was measured not by the ticking of a clock, but by the steady, unrelenting flow of the silt-heavy water toward the sea. The stars grew more numerous and brighter with every passing moment, casting a faint, silvery path across the water that danced and shattered with every minor ripple, illuminating the path ahead where the river curved gracefully into the unknown reaches of the valley. The palm trees on the banks were now mere ink blots against the stars, their feathery fronds invisible to the eye, but their presence felt in the way they broke the horizon line and muffled the wind. As the boat glided further, the warmth of the sun-baked wood underfoot slowly gave way to a crisp, clean coolness, and the sounds of the shore, the crickets in the grass, the dry rustle of the reeds began to feel like memories of another land, leaving only the ship and the great dark mirror of the Nile to navigate the stillness of the emerging night. The water beneath the hull felt deeper now, a vast volume of life moving in total silence, carrying the boat over submerged ruins and hidden gardens with the same indifference it showed to the desert sands. In this deep indigo hour, the textures of the boat became more pronounced to the touch. The roughness of the palm ropes, the smoothness of the polished cedar rail, and the soft give of the woven mats. The mast continued its slow, metronomic sweep across the constellations of the southern sky, its tip tracing invisible arcs through the dense clusters of light that defined the Egyptian night. Beneath the hull, the river shifted its character, the water becoming a thick, heavy velvet that seemed to vibrate with the sheer volume of the flow originating from the distant mountains of the south. The current at this hour was deceptive, appearing as a mirror-flat surface but revealing its true power in the way the rudder groaned softly against its wooden housing. The steersman, standing tall at the stern with his weight shifted onto one leg, felt the subtle feedback of the river through the grain of the long oar, a constant dialogue between the vessel and the silt-laden depths. There were places where the current quickened, creating small, swirling eddies that hissed like escaping steam as they brushed against the cedar planks, and other moments where the boat seemed to enter a deeper, quieter pool of water that allowed for a longer, more rhythmic glide. Hidden sandbanks, those shifting spirits of the riverbed, were navigated not by sight but by the sound of the water's ripple and the way the light of the stars broke differently over the shallows. The crew moved with the silent grace of those who have lived their entire lives in accordance with the river's whims. Two men shared a low bench near the bow, their white kilts now a soft, pearlescent grey in the starlight. One reached out with a hand calloused by rope and water to check the tension of the linen lashings that held the whole together, feeling for the slight expansion of the fibres as they absorbed the night's humidity. The joinery of the ship, a masterpiece of mortise and tenon construction without a single iron nail, breathed with the temperature. As the desert air cooled, the cedar and sycamore planks contracted slightly, their subtle movements creating a chorus of tiny, rhythmic creaks that sounded like the vessel was whispering to itself. A young sailor moved toward the mast to check the seals on the clay water jars, his fingers tracing the rim of the mud bungs to ensure the night's dampness hadn't softened the clay too much. He adjusted a bundle of palm fiber ropes that had begun to slacken in the cooling air, the dry rasp of the fibers against the wood providing a percussive counterpoint to the water's constant song. High above the Milky Way, that celestial river of white light known to the priests as the true path of the gods, spanned the vault from horizon to horizon, its brilliance so intense that it cast a ghost light across the deck, illuminating the fine weave of the linen canopy. The star Sothis, the herald of the inundation, hung like a diamond above the eastern bank, its blue-white fire piercing the haze of the horizon and reflecting in the dark water as a series of dancing, elongated sparks. To the Egyptians on board, this was not merely a sky but a map of the afterlife and a reflection of the geography of the Kemat, where every star had its correspondence in the temples and cities of the land. The constellation of Orion, the great Tsar, began to tilt toward the west, his belt stars glowing with a cold, steady light that seemed to watch over the boat's progress. The air was now fully saturated with the scent of the river Arich. Mineral smell of wet earth and ancient stones mixed with the faint, sweet perfume of night-blooming jasmine that drifted from an unseen garden on the shore. Occasionally, the silhouette of a mud-brick village would appear as a slightly darker mass against the desert cliffs, punctuated only by the dying ember of a communal hearth-fire that pulsed like a low-magnitude star. In the reeds along the bank, a heavy animal, perhaps a hippopotamus or a thirsty gazelle, shifted its weight. The sound of splashing water and snapping papyrus stems traveling clearly across the stillness to the ears of the watchman. The boat glided past the dark, jagged outline of a pylon gate, its massive sandstone form appearing as a mountain of shadow that momentarily eclipsed the stars of the horizon. A monument to a pharaoh whose name was carved in the very stone but spoken now only by the wind. The deck beneath bare feet was now cool to the touch, the last of the day's solar warmth having been surrendered to the night air, yet it remained a comforting, solid presence amidst the fluidity of the journey. The condensation on the clay jars had formed thick droplets that ran down the terracotta sides, a small, localized rain that dampened the woven mats. The rhythm of the rudder became more pronounced as the river took a long, sweeping turn to the north, the water pushing against the port side and creating a soft, rhythmic drumming against the hull. The steersman adjusted his grip, the wood of the oar polished to a mirror sheen by years of oil and sweat, feeling the weight of the Nile as it pressed against the vessel's intention. There was no haste in his movements, only a total alignment with the river's pace. Small maintenance tasks continued in the dim light. A sailor used a small stone to smooth the rough edge on an oarlock, the scrape of the task sounding like a cricket's chirp. The humidity had caused the linen sail, though furled, to grow heavy and stiff, its bulk casting a long, rectangular shadow across the center of the deck where the reed baskets of figs and bread sat undisturbed. The world felt immense and protective, the boat a tiny, orderly universe held in the hand of the primordial waters. The distant desert acoustics brought the sound of the wind whistling through the limestone canyons, a high, lonely note that contrasted with the deep bass thrum of the river. The irrigation canals, those silver ribbons of the dusk, were now invisible, their presence known only by the way the palm trees clustered in straight, dark lines along the horizon. As the hours deepened toward the true midnight, the stars seemed to multiply, filling every void in the blackness until the sky was more light than dark. The crew rotated their watch with a silent nod, one man slipping into the shadows of the canopy to rest, while another rose to take his place, his movements practiced and noiseless so as not to disturb the profound equilibrium of the ship. The smell of the water upstream began to change, bringing a hint of the granite canyons of Aswan and the distant, flowering acacias of the south. The boat was now in the deepest part of the channel, where the water was so dark it seemed to swallow the light of the stars entirely, reflecting nothing but the absolute depth of the stream. In this silence, the sound of one's own breathing became part of the ship's atmosphere, a steady rise and fall that mirrored the gentle heave of the hull. The wood of the ship continued its nocturnal settling, the cedar planks groaning with a sound like a distant cello as they adjusted to the mounting weight of the night's moisture. The linen lashings, tight and secure, held the vessel in a firm but flexible embrace, allowing it to move with the water rather than against it. Far to the east, the darkness began to lose its absolute quality, not yet turning to light, but becoming a thinner, more translucent shade of indigo that suggested the world had a boundary. The stars in that quarter of the sky seemed to lose a fraction of their sharpness, though the rest of the vault remained a dazzling display of celestial fire. The silhouette of the mast, swaying gently against the fading belt of the Milky Way, continued its rhythmic journey, a dark finger pointing toward the mysteries of the coming hours. The air grew slightly more agitated, a pre-dawn breeze beginning to stir the surface of the river into 1,000 tiny silver-capped ripples that hissed against the bow. The smell of wood smoke returned, fainter now, as the first bakers in the distant villages began to stir their fires for the morning loaves. The boat, indifferent to the coming change, remained caught in the timeless flow of the current, its cedar hull slicing through the water with the same steady, unhurried grace it had maintained since the first light of dusk had vanished. The crew remained still, shadows among shadows, their eyes fixed on the shifting textures of the water ahead, where the river continued its eternal curve through the heart of the black land, carrying the vessel and its silent passengers deeper into the unfolding story of the Nile. The thinning of the darkness on the eastern horizon continued its slow, spectral expansion, a pale wash of charcoal grey beginning to dissolve the deep indigo of the sky. The stars, which had ruled the night with such absolute authority, started to retreat into the deepening vault with the brightest among them, like the great Sothis and the belt of Orion, lingering as sharp, white pinpricks against the changing atmosphere. The transition was barely perceptible at first, felt more in the temperature of the air than in the sight of the eyes. A sharp, crisp coolness began to roll off the desert sands, meeting the humid breath of the Nile and creating a fine ethereal mist that clung to the surface of the water in shifting, translucent ribbons. This pre-dawn chill was a physical weight, settling on the cedar planks of the deck and causing a light dew to form over the reed baskets and the linen canopy. The crew, sensing the change in the rhythm of the world, began to move with a renewed but still hushed purpose. The night watchman at the bow stood up, his joints making a soft, rhythmic pop as he stretched his arms toward the fading constellations, while another sailor emerged from the shadows beneath the canopy to take over the long steering oar. Their exchange was silent, a mere nodding of heads as the weight of the rudder passed from one set of calloused hands to another. The wood of the ship, which had groaned and whispered in the cold of the deep night, seemed to settle into a more expectant silence, as if the vessel itself were waiting for the first touch of the sun to warm its timber. Along the riverbanks, the absolute silence of the midnight hours began to fragment into the first tentative sounds of life. A single waterfowl, hidden deep within the papyrus thickets, let out a low, croaking call that was soon answered by another further downstream, a cascading series of ripples in the acoustic landscape. The rustle of the wind through the reeds changed its pitch, losing the dry, brittle sound of the night and gaining a softer, more supple quality as the humidity of the dawn air reached them. The mist on the water grew thicker for a brief window of time, obscuring the base of the palm trees on the banks so that their feathery fronds appeared to float in a sea of white cloud, disconnected from the earth. As the grey-blue hour took hold, the world began to regain its three-dimensional form. The limestone cliffs to the west, which had been mere silhouettes, started to show the intricate patterns of their erosion, the deep fissures and shadows of the rock faces becoming visible as the light diffused through the atmosphere. The irrigation canals, previously invisible in the dark, reappeared as dull, leaden lines cutting through the black soil of the fields, their surfaces still and somber. The boat continued its steady, unhurried glide through the center of the current, the water hissing softly against the hull with a sound that felt more energized than it had an hour before. The indigo sky shifted into a bruised violet, then a soft, dusty rose, and finally a clear, pale saffron along the edge of the world. The first rays of the sun had not yet cleared the eastern hills, but the light was sufficient now to reveal the fine details of the riverbank life that was stirring into motion. Near the muddy edge of the water, a group of fishermen had already begun their morning labor, their narrow skiffs made of bundled papyrus reeds riding low in the water. They moved with a silent, coordinated grace, standing upright in their fragile craft and casting woven nets with a rhythmic flick of the wrist that sent the mesh spiraling outward in a perfect circle before it slapped the surface of the Nile and sank into the silt. The boat passed them closely enough to hear the soft splash of the lead weights and the low melodic hum of a working song, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very air. Further up the bank, where the black earth met the green line of the cultivation, the farmers were appearing from their mud-brick homes, leading pairs of heavy, slow-moving oxen toward the fields. The annual flood had left behind a rich, dark layer of sediment that was still moist, and the wooden plows carved deep, satisfying furrows into the earth, the scent of fresh soil drifting across the water to the deck of the vessel. Women in shifts of undyed linen walked in single file along the embankments, their movements steady and practiced as they balanced large, rounded clay water jars on their heads. They moved toward the river with a stability that made the jars seem like an extension of their own bodies, their voices rising in brief, bright patches of conversation that carried clearly across the water before fading into the distance. Near the village outskirts, the outdoor clay ovens were being stoked, sending thin, blue-white plumes of smoke into the morning air, carrying the unmistakable, warm aroma of baking emmer bread and dried chaff. Children could be seen running between the houses and the edges of the smaller canals, their small figures moving with the quick, darting energy of the morning, some stopping to watch the large cedar vessel as it drifted past their stretch of the river. The landscape was becoming a tapestry of movement and sound, a symphony of daily existence that had played out in this valley for millennia. Along the banks, the rhythmic creak of the shadoof began to punctuate the morning. The long wooden poles with their leather buckets and limestone counterweights dipping into the canals and rising, again to pour life-giving water into the higher channels. The sound was a steady wooden groan, a mechanical heartbeat that spoke of the constant effort required to keep the desert at bay. As the sun finally crested the horizon, the character of the Nile underwent a dramatic transformation. The brushed metal surface of the dawn was replaced by a brilliant molten gold that seemed to burn with a cool fire. Every ripple in the water, every wake from a passing waterfowl, was caught in this new light, creating a shimmering field of radiance that stretched out ahead of the bow. The reeds along the bank bent in a gentler morning breeze, their green heads nodding in unison, while the hull of the boat responded to the warming air with a series of soft, resonant thuds as the wood expanded. The cooling dampness of the night was rapidly being chased away, replaced by a clean, dry heat that felt revitalizing. The crew had now fully transitioned into their morning routines. The linen canopy was adjusted to provide better shade from the rising sun, and the clay jars were unsealed. The water inside poured into smaller bowls for the morning's refreshment. The bread from the reed baskets was shared among the men, the sound of their quiet chewing and the occasional soft word creating a sense of grounded companionship. The river seemed to widen as the boat moved further north, the banks receding slightly to reveal the vastness of the cultivated valley. A lush green carpet bordered by the harsh, unyielding yellow of the high desert. The ancient pylons of a distant temple complex appeared on the horizon, their massive forms catching the full strength of the morning sun and glowing with a pale, sandy radiance. The statues of the gods and kings that guarded the entrances looked out over the river with eternal, unblinking eyes, witnesses to the passage of the boat and the thousands of others like it that had navigated these waters. The current remained steady and supportive, a deep, invisible hand that guided the cedar planks with an effortless power. The smell of the morning was a complex blend of blooming acacia, the sharp temps of the river silt, the smoke of the hearth fires, and the clean ozone scent of the moving water. The light was now reaching into every corner of the deck, illuminating the fine grain of the sycamore wood and the intricate patterns of the woven mats, making the vessel feel like a bright, living entity in the center of the great stream. The movement was so fluid that the passage of time was marked only by the shifting angle of the sun and the changing activities on the shore. More boats were appearing on the river now, small merchant craft carrying grain and livestock, their sails white and triangular like the wings of giant birds, and larger, more ornate vessels with painted hulls that suggested the presence of higher-reaching officials or priests. Each craft kept to its own path in the broad current, a silent acknowledgement of the shared journey. The river began to curve again, a long, elegant bend that brought the vessel closer to a grove of tall date palms, their heavy clusters of fruit hanging like jewels against the blue of the sky. The sound of the wind through the palm fronds was a dry, papyrus-like rattle, a reminder of the desert's proximity even in the heart of this fertile paradise. The boat continued to glide, the rhythm of the water against the bow remaining the constant, hypnotic foundation of the experience. The sky was now a brilliant, cloudless azure, the kind of deep, saturated color that only exists in the dry air of the valley. The horizon shimmered slightly with the first hints of the midday heat, but on the water the breeze remained cool and refreshing. The journey felt as though it had no beginning and no end, only a continuous state of being carried by the Nile, a surrender to the ancient and predictable flow of the world. The mast silhouette, no longer a dark line against the stars, was now a warm, honey-colored pole that pointed toward the zenith, its shadow shortening on the deck as the morning matured. The water-lifting devices on the shore continued their rhythmic labor, the sound blending with the distant calls of the farmers and the splashing of the fishermen's nets, creating a texture of sound that was both vibrant and deeply peaceful. The golden light of the early morning had now fully claimed the valley, transforming the river into a shimmering expanse of pale amber that seemed to vibrate with the rising warmth. The boat continued its steady, effortless glide, the current carrying it with a silent authority that required little more than the occasional, resonant adjustment of the steering or ahead, where the river made a long, graceful sweep toward the eastern bank. The morning haze began to thin, revealing the colossal outlines of a temple complex that seemed to grow out of the very earth. At first, it was merely a suggestion of geometry against the soft blue of the sky, the slanted, monumental lines of the twin pylon gates rising above the feathery canopy of the palm groves. As the vessel drew closer, the sheer scale of the sandstone structures became more apparent, their massive surfaces catching the direct rays of the sun and glowing with a deep, honey-colored radiance. The pylon walls were covered in vast, rhythmic carvings, the recessed lines of the hieroglyphs casting sharp, geometric shadows that gave the stone a living, breathing texture. High atop the gates, cedar flagstaffs stood tall, their long, blue and gold banners hanging in heavy, motionless folds in the still air, waiting for the first true breeze of the day to wake them. The sound of the river changed as the boat neared the temple's stone quay. The open, rushing hiss of the mid-channel gave way to a deeper, more hollow gurgle as the water brushed against the submerged foundations of the embankment. The crew adjusted their rhythm with practiced ease, the long sycamore oars dipping into the water with a synchronized, rhythmic splash that sounded like a slow heartbeat. Each stroke sent a series of concentric silver rings out toward the temple walls, mirroring the stability of the architecture. A scent began to drift across the water, cutting through the vegetal smell of the reeds a thin, elegant trail of burning Kifi incense, smelling of honey, resins, and sweet myrrh, suggesting that the morning rites within the inner sanctum were already underway. As the boat drifted past the main entrance, the forest of columns in the outer court became visible, their massive papyrus-shaped capitals painted in vibrant shades of malachite green and ochre, still bright despite the passage of centuries. Between these pillars, the air was cooler, a preserved pocket of shadow that smelled of old stone and sacred stillness. Figures moved slowly within the colonnade's priests in garments of such fine, bleached linen that they appeared translucent in the morning sun, their shaved heads reflecting the light as they performed the quiet, necessary tasks of the temple's maintenance. They moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace, their presence adding a layer of human continuity to the eternal stone. On a raised terrace overlooking the water, a seated statue of the deity looked out toward the horizon with eyes of inlaid stone, a silent, monumental witness to the river's flow. The texture of the sandstone was so clear now that one could see the individual grains and the subtle variations in color, from a pale cream to a deep, iron-rich orange, all of it vibrating under the mounting heat of the sun. The boat did not stop, but the slow pace of its passage allowed for a deep, cinematic immersion into the temple's atmosphere. The rhythmic creak of the rudder and the soft, repetitive song of the oars provided a grounding tempo to the visual grandeur. The painted reliefs on the outer walls depicted the gods and the king in an eternal dance of balance, their forms carved with a precision that seemed to defy the hardness of the material. As the vessel moved beyond the main pylon, the sounds of the temple, the low murmur of a chant, the distant clink of a metal vessel against stone gradually blended back into the natural sounds of the Nile. The water widened again, and the temple began its slow retreat into the background, its pylons remaining visible for a long time as a steady, reassuring landmark on the edge of the cultivated land. The light on the water was now a more intense, brilliant white, and the shadows of the mast and the rigging grew shorter on the deck. The warmth of the day was becoming more pronounced, a comfortable, dry heat that seemed to settle into the wood of the boat and the skin of the travelers. Ahead, the river stretched out in a long, sun-drenched ribbon, the current as reliable as the movement of the stars had been only hours before. The greenery of the banks seemed even more vibrant in the full light, the emerald fields of emmer and flax standing in sharp contrast to the stark, violet-tinted shadows of the distant desert cliffs. The boat remained a world unto itself, a small, floating island of cedar and linen, moving in perfect harmony with the pulse of the great river as it journeyed deeper into the heart of the day. The temple's silent blessing lingering in the scent of the incense that still clung faintly to the breeze. The distance between the boat and the stone quay began to increase, but the temple's presence lingered like a low, resonant note. From this slightly further vantage point, one could see how the architects had aligned the complex with the movements of the sun. The shadows of the pylons stretching across the courtyard with mathematical precision, the carvings of the great kings smiting his enemies and offering libations to the gods were now partially obscured by the angle of the light. But the depth of the incisions still gave the walls a shimmering, multifaceted appearance. The water of the Nile, catching the reflection of the sandstone, took on a warmer, tawny hue near the shore, contrasting with the deep, cool blue of the central channel. The rhythmic sound of the oars, which had echoed against the stone walls with a sharp percussive quality, now softened into a muffled thud as the sound dispersed over the open water. The cooling air of the temple's shadow was replaced by the full, unfiltered brilliance of the mid-morning sun, which felt like a soft, heavy blanket on the shoulders. The cedar deck was now warm to the touch, and the resinous smell of the timber became more pronounced, a sweet, earthy scent that mingled with the dry fragrance of the desert wind. In the distance, the palm trees that lined the riverbank seemed to sway in a slow-motion dance, their fronds catching the light and reflecting it in flashes of silver and green. The irrigation canals, though hidden from direct view, were marked by the lushness of the vegetation that surrounded them, thick groves of sycamore figs and stands of tall, green papyrus that provided shelter for a multitude of birds. A pair of kingfishers darted across the bow, their feathers a brilliant metallic blue that seemed to hold a light of its own, while a heron stood motionless in the shallows, a patient grey sentinel of the silt. The boat felt heavier now, more grounded in the water, as if the rising temperature had increased the density of the air and the liquid. The crew's movements remained economical and quiet. One man sat by the mast, his eyes half closed against the glare, while another adjusted the lashing of a large clay jar, the sound of the palm rope rasping against the terracotta. The sense of peace was absolute, a combination of the river's steady flow and the timeless stability of the monuments on the shore. The temple, now a smaller but no less impressive silhouette against the eastern horizon, appeared as a gateway between the world of men and the world of the gods, a point of stillness in a landscape of constant, fluid change. The light on the water was so bright that the surface seemed to dissolve into a field of pure radiance, making it difficult to discern where the river ended and the sky began. The horizon shimmered with the first hints of a heat haze, blurring the line between the green of the fields and the golden brown of the desert beyond. The boat continued its northward journey, the current a gentle but insistent guide that required no effort to follow. The rhythmic creak of the rudder, the soft lap of the water against the hull, and the distant, melodic calls of the river birds formed a tapestry of sound that was both intimate and vast. The journey was no longer just a transit from one place to another, but a deep, meditative experience of the landscape and its history. Every detail, from the texture of the linen canopy to the play of light on the sandstone walls, was a testament to the enduring beauty of the new kingdom. The sun, now approaching its zenith, cast a short, intense shadow that emphasized the solidity of the vessel and the reality of the moment. The river widened further, its banks retreating into the distance and giving the impression of an endless, sunlit world where time had slowed to the pace of a dream. The boat, with its cargo of bread and figs and its crew of silent watchers, was a tiny, purposeful spark in the immense, golden heart of the Nile, drifting ever deeper into the profound and unchanging stillness of the morning. The scent of the incense had finally faded, replaced by the pure, clean smell of the sun on the water and the dry, ancient dust of the desert. The landscape was a study in contrasts, the vibrant, living green of the valley against the stark, eternal silence of the cliffs, the moving water against the unmoving stone. The vessel glided on, its path as certain as the rising of the sun, a part of the river's long and storied life. The sound of a distant horn, perhaps from another boat or a temple further downriver, carried clearly across the water a single, clear note that hung in the air for a moment before dissolving into the general murmur of the day. The journey continued, a slow and graceful progression through a land of light and shadow, where every moment was a gift from the gods and every breath was full of the spirit of the Nile. The sun continued its steady ascent, shedding the soft, honeyed tones of the early morning to embrace a brilliant, crystalline clarity that made the entire Nile Valley pulse with life and light. As the great cedar vessel drifted further from the stone silence of the temple complex, the world of the living reclaimed the riverbanks in a tapestry of emerald green and rich, dark earth. The boat remained held in the invisible grip of the central current, moving with the grace that felt ancient and inevitable, while the crew began to adjust the rigging to welcome a gentle northern breeze that was just beginning to stir the reeds. The transition of the light was subtle but profound. The long, dramatic shadows of the dawn had contracted into sharp, dark pools beneath the date palms, and the golden shimmer on the water had intensified into a bright, almost white radiance that forced the eyes to squint at the horizon. Along the fertile banks, the agricultural heart of the new kingdom beat with a slow and steady rhythm, a symphony of labor that felt perfectly attuned to the rising heat. In the vast irrigated fields of emmer, wheat, and barley, the stalks swayed like a golden sea, their heavy heads bowing under the weight of the grain. Farmers moved through the rows with a quiet, practiced determination, their skin darkened by the sun and polished by honest sweat, their white linen kilts bright against a deep black of the silt. Between the fields, the geometry of the irrigation canals cut through the landscape in straight silver lines, reflecting the unclouded sky with a mirror-like intensity that made the water appear as if it were carved from liquid sapphire. At regular intervals along these narrow waterways, the wooden shadoofs stood as skeletal sentinels of the harvest. These long, pivoted poles, balanced by heavy counterweights of limestone, rose and fell in a metronomic dance that defined the soundscape of the late morning. One could hear the rhythmic, high-pitched creak of the wooden beams as they groaned under the weight of the water, followed by the soft, heavy splash as the leather buckets dipped into the canal and emerged brimming with the river's lifeblood. The water spilled over into the smaller channels with a cool, cascading sound, a liquid music that spoke of growth and abundance in the face of the encroaching desert, clustered among the thick groves of date palms. The mud-brick houses of the villagers appeared as solid, earth-toned anchors in the shifting green of the fields. Their flat roofs were often piled with drying stalks of flax or bundles of reeds, and in the shaded courtyards between the dwellings, children moved with a light, playful energy, their small figures darting between the columns of light and shadow. On the low walls of the courtyards, freshly washed linen garments were spread out to dry, their textures appearing crisp and blindingly white in the sun, capturing the scent of the river and the desert air. Along the narrow embankments that served as the highways of the valley, donkeys walked with a slow, swaying gait, their panniers filled with bundles of green fodder or jars of grain. Behind them, or perhaps in the adjacent fields, teams of powerful oxen turned the soil with heavy wooden plows. Their rhythmic breathing and the soft thud of their hooves on the earth creating a bass note to the morning's activity. The heat of the late morning began to settle over the landscape like a warm, heavy blanket, yet it was not oppressive. Rather, it felt like a ripening force. The scent of the world changed as the moisture evaporated from the fields, giving way to the rich, earthy fragrance of wet soil warming under the sun and the sweet, resinous perfume of blooming acacia trees. Above the narrow canals, dragonflies with wings like spun glass hovered in the still air, their bodies flashing in shades of copper and cobalt as they darted between the papyrus stems. The low hum of insects rose in a steady vibration with the heat, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very earth itself. On the deck of the boat, the transformation was equally tangible. The cedar planks, once cool and damp with the dew of the night, were now warm and dry beneath bare feet, radiating a gentle heat that travelled upward through the body. The mast cast a sharp, dark line across the deck, providing a shifting sliver of shade for the crew members who were not occupied with the sail. As the northern breeze strengthened, the great linen sail was partially unfurled, its heavy fabric catching the wind with a soft, resonant thwomp that vibrated through the hull. The sail filled slowly, the linen stretching tight and causing a gentle fluttering sound at the edges, a sound like a distant bird taking flight. This new force carried the boat forward with even less effort from the steersman, the vessel slicing through the water with a clean, hissing sound that played against the rhythmic lap of the waves. The people along the banks, seen from the mid-channel, appeared as part of a grand, harmonious design. Their movements never hurried, never frantic. A farmer might pause for a moment, leaning on his staff to watch the boat pass, his hand shielded against the glare of the sun, before returning to the steady work of the day. There was a profound sense of continuity in their labor, a knowledge that these same tasks had been performed by their fathers and would be performed by their sons, guided by the rising and falling of the river. Midway through this stretch of the journey, as the sun climbed toward its zenith, a perceptible change began to wash over the valley. The frantic energy of the early morning started to yield to the necessity of the midday rest. Farmers began to retreat toward the deep shade of the sycamore figs that stood at the edges of the fields, gathering their tools and settling onto the cool earth. Small groups of workers clustered around large clay jars, the water inside kept cool by the evaporation through the porous ceramic, and the sound of their quiet talk and occasional laughter drifted across the water in soft, fragmented patches. The animals, too, sought refuge from the mounting brilliance. The oxen were unyoked and led to the shallows of the river or the shade of the palms, where they stood with half-closed eyes, flicking their tails in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. The river itself seemed to grow brighter and more reflective, the surface becoming a vast, undulating mirror of white and gold that dissolved the details of the far shore into a shimmering haze. The soundscape softened significantly, the creaking of the shadoofs and the calls of the field hands fading into a general ambient drone of heat and water. The boat, however, remained in motion, a solitary traveller in the stillness of the high sun. The breeze was now a steady, cooling companion, keeping the air on the deck fresh even as the world around it simmered. The heat began to feel heavy and peaceful, a physical presence that encouraged a deep, observational stillness. The crew sat in the shadows of the canopy or the sail, their eyes fixed on the distant reaches of the river, where the horizon shimmered with the first hints of a heat haze. The water remained deep and dark beneath the surface radiance, its power hidden but ever present, a silent engine that moved the kingdom toward its future. As the journey progressed into the heart of the midday, a subtle change began to manifest in the distance ahead. The wide, fertile plains that had dominated the landscape for many leagues seemed to subtly contract. On the eastern bank, the line of the desert cliffs began to edge closer to the water's edge, their limestone faces appearing more jagged and prominent against the sky. Faint dark outcrops of rock began to suggest themselves through the midday shimmer, hinting at a place where the river might narrow or where the terrain might become more rugged and ancient. These were not yet fully formed features, but rather a promise of a transition yet to come, a shift in the geography of the journey that lay just beyond the next long bend of the Nile. For now, the boat remained suspended in the quiet brilliance of the high morning, a world of sun-warmed wood, white linen, and the endless, life-giving flow of the water. The rhythmic creak of the rudder and the soft flutter of the sail were the only interruptions in the profound peace of the hour. The boat continued its steady, unhurried path, drifting toward the subtle change on the horizon, carried by the wind and the river through the heart of a land that felt as eternal as the sun itself. The light was now at its most intense, washing out the colors of the valley into a highky palette of emerald, gold, and bone white, yet within the vessel. The atmosphere remained cool and sheltered. The journey flowed on, a single, unbroken thread of movement in a landscape that had paused to breathe under the weight of the midday sun, moving ever forward into the shimmering mystery of the afternoon. The high midday sun had finally begun its long, measured descent toward the western horizon, and as it did, the blinding white glare that had dominated the center of the Nile started to dissolve into a richer, more substantial quality of light. The boat still held in the steady, rhythmic embrace of the current, moved with an unhurried grace toward the eastern bank, where the limestone cliffs stood like ancient, silent guardians of the valley's edge. The transformation of the light was a slow and beautiful process. The harsh, flat brilliance of noon was being replaced by a deepening amber that began to pick out the subtle textures of the landscape afine. Wind-carved ridges of the stone, the individual fronds of the distant palms, and the intricate weave of the papyrus thick. As the boat drifted closer to the rocky shore, the shadows along the cliffs grew longer and more defined, casting deep, violet-tinted pools of coolness across the sun-bleached stone. This shift in light was accompanied by a subtle but welcome cooling of the northern breeze, which had found a new consistency as the day matured. The great linen sail, once hanging heavy and still, now filled more steadily, its cream-colored fabric swelling into a soft, rounded curve that hummed with the energy of the wind. The sound of the vessel changed accordingly. The quiet lap of the water was joined by the rhythmic, melodic creaking of the palm fiber ropes as they tightened against the cedar masts, a sound that spoke of the ship's internal life and its harmony with the elements. The wood itself, warmed by hours of direct sun, seemed to exhale a dry, resinous perfume that mingled with the damp, mineral scent of the river. The water of the Nile was undergoing its own transition, shifting from a sheet of polished silver into a deep, translucent blue-green that held the reflections of the cliffs in its undulating depths. Near the hull, small ripples broke in a constant, whispering cadence, and occasionally a large river fish would break the surface in a flash of silver scales. leaving behind a series of widening rings that danced in the afternoon light. Closer to the rocky bank, the water took on a darker, more mysterious tone, sheltered from the full strength of the sun by the looming stone. This was the environment into which the small riverside settlement began to emerge, not as a sudden intrusion, but as a natural extension of the landscape itself, built directly against the protective face of the limestone. The mud brick houses were the color of the earth from which they were fashioned, warm ochres and dusty browns that seemed to vibrate in the softening light. The architecture was simple and functional, designed for the climate and the river's seasons, with flat rooftops where palm fiber mats had been spread out to catch the last of the day's heat. Long lines of clay jars, their surfaces sweating slightly from the cooling water within, were arranged neatly along the base of the walls, and small wooden docks or stone steps led directly from the house entrances into the slow-moving edge of the river. Faint strands of blue smoke rose in perfectly vertical lines from the domestic hearths, signaling the commencement of the evening meal preparations. Near the shaded walls, goats and donkeys moved with a lazy, rhythmic pace, their hooves making a soft, dusty thud against the packed earth. Along the water's edge, the social life of the village was unfolding in a series of quiet, timeless vignettes. Children played near the shallows, their laughter carried softly across the water on the breeze, while women knelt on smooth, flat stones to wash linen, the rhythmic slap of the fabric against the rock providing a percussive counterpoint to the river's flow. In a deeper patch of shadow beneath a sycamore fig, a potter sat at his wheel, his hands coated in the slick, grey silt of the Nile as he coaxed a new jar into being, his movements as steady and deliberate as the current itself. The air was filled with a low, melodic murmur of conversation, a human sound that felt deeply integrated into the natural ambience of the reeds and the wind. The boat did not rush its arrival. Instead, it drifted along the periphery of the settlement, allowing the travelers to observe the intimate details of this riverside existence. The texture of the mud brick walls was visible now, the straw-flecked clay, the fingerprints of the builders, the subtle cracks where the sun had baked the earth. The scent of the village drifted over the deck, the warm, yeasty aroma of baking emmer bread, the sharp tense of wood smoke, and the earthy smell of grinding grain as heavy stones were turned in courtyard corners. There was a profound sense of continuity here, a feeling that this rhythm of life had been maintained for 1,000 years and would remain for 1,000 more. The villagers looked up from their tasks as the large cedar vessel glided past, their gazes calm and filled with a quiet curiosity, a silent acknowledgement of the shared journey along the Great Green. As the late afternoon progressed, the golden tones of the sky deepened into a warm, saturated honey, and the sun, though still high enough to cast a powerful glow, began to lose its piercing intensity. The shadows of the masts and the rigging stretched across the deck in long, elegant lines, and the air grew noticeably fresher, carrying the scent of the cooling desert from beyond the cliffs. Every sensory moment was expanded by the slow pace of the journey, the way the light caught the edge of a clay jar, the sound of a distant bird calling from the marshes, the feel of the warming wood beneath bare feet. The writing of the day was being inscribed in the lengthening shadows and the changing colors of the water. The boat began to slow its pace, the steersman guiding it with a light but firm hand toward a modest landing area where the stone of the cliff met a patch of cleared, level ground. The movement was almost imperceptible, a gradual alignment with the shore that felt as natural as a leaf settling on a pond. The air was cooling rapidly now, and the settlement seemed to grow even warmer in color, its mud brick walls glowing with an inner radiance as they captured the final, direct rays of the sun. The river too was darkening, its blue-green depths turning toward a somber, regal navy, while the surface remained a field of dancing, golden sparks. There was a sense of profound timelessness in this transition, a suspension of the world between the activity of the day and the coming stillness of the night. The vessel remained in motion, a living thing of wood and linen, preparing itself for the next phase of the journey as the afternoon began its slow, inevitable surrender to the early evening. The rhythmic creak of the rudder and the soft, steady fill of the sail remained the constant heartbeat of the experience, a sound that promised a continuation of this peace into the hours of twilight and beyond. The limestone cliffs were now a deep, glowing orange, their peaks silhouetted against a sky that was beginning to hint at the violets and pinks of the coming sunset. The landing area drew closer, a place of transition where the river's journey paused but never truly stopped. Held in the eternal flow of the Nile, the water near the landing was still and deep, reflecting the darkening sky like a dark gemstone, and the sound of the village grew clearer, the bleating of a goat, the clinking of a metal vessel, the soft call of a mother to her child. The boat continued its graceful approach, the current whispering against the hull for a few moments more before the first line would be cast, a silent traveller moving through a landscape of light, stone, and memory. The warmth of the sun-baked wood still lingered in the deck, providing a comforting heat as the air continued to freshen, and the scent of the evening began to dominate the breeze, the smell of the river, the smoke, and the cooling earth. The journey was unfolding in a series of slow, deliberate movements, a testament to the enduring rhythm of the new kingdom and the life-giving power of the Nile. Every detail was a thread in a larger tapestry, a world where the gods moved in the wind and the water, and where time was measured not by hours, but by the shifting of the light across the face of the stone. The boat was a part of this world, a floating sanctuary that carried the stories of the river within its cedar planks, moving ever forward into the quiet, unfolding mystery of the Egyptian evening. The sky above was a vast, clear expanse, waiting for the first stars to claim their places, while below, the river continued its tireless journey toward the sea, carrying the boat and its silent watchers toward the next horizon. The settlement was now fully present, a world of texture and sound that welcomed the vessel with its own ancient and predictable peace. The transition was nearly complete, the day's work yielding to the rest of the evening, and the boat, steady and sure, found its place in the deepening shadows of the cliffs, a part of the landscape, a part of the river, and a part of the eternal story of the Nile. The cedar vessel, still vibrating with the memory of the river's deep pulse, began its final, measured approach toward the stone landing, the gap between the hull and the shore narrowing with the slow, deliberate certainty of a closing eye. The steersman leaned into the great oar, feeling the water's resistance thicken as the boat moved out of the central current and into the shallower, more dormant waters near the bank. There was a profound, heavy silence that seemed to descend as the velocity of the journey transitioned into stillness, a silence punctuated only by the rhythmic, hollow gurgle of the Nile as it brushed against the limestone steps of the village quay. The first contact was almost imperceptible, a soft, resonant brush of cedar against worn stone, a sound like a deep exhale that traveled through the deck and into the soles of the feet. This was followed by the muffled, rhythmic thud of a heavy pomfiber rope being cast onto the landing, its braided length uncoiling through the air before being expertly caught and looped around a sturdy wooden post that had been polished to a mirror sheen by decades of similar arrivals. The vessel gave a slight, graceful shudder as the line tightened, a slow shift of balance that required a momentary adjustment of the weight. And then, for the first time in many leagues, the boat was steady. The texture of the landing area was a mosaic of the valley's history. Limestone blocks smoothed by centuries of footsteps, patches of dark sun-baked earth, and the desiccated remains of river reeds embedded into the mud at the water's edge. Once the current was no longer pulling freely at the hull, the world seemed to expand in its quietude. The constant hiss of moving water was replaced by the intimate, domestic sounds of the settlement as it prepared for the transition into evening. Stepping from the wooden deck onto the solid ground was a sensory revelation. The earth beneath bare feet was not yet cool. It retained a deep, radiant warmth from the day's relentless sun, a thermal memory that felt grounding and ancient. The air here was thicker than it had been in mid-channel, heavy with the domestic fragrances of the new kingdom. The primary scent was that of baking emmer grain and the sweet, yeasty aroma of fresh bread rising from clay ovens, mingled with the sharper, more pungent smell of low dung fires that smouldered in the courtyards. In the nearby enclosures, the rhythmic turning of a grinding stone created a low, percussive drone, the sound of grain being transformed into flour by the steady pressure of human hands. A large clay pot, blackened by fire, simmered gently over a bed of embers, the steam carrying the scent of lentils and onions into the cooling air. Along the low mud brick walls, the white linen garments that had spent the day catching the sun were now being folded with practiced care, the fabric still holding the crispness of the river breeze. Clay jars, their exteriors damp with the last of the afternoon's evaporation, were being moved into the deeper shadows of the doorways and sealed with mud bungs to preserve the sweetness of the water for the night ahead. The early evening rhythm of the settlement was a masterpiece of unhurried motion. In the narrow alleys and open courtyards, children were being called indoors by the soft, melodic voices of their mothers, their small shadows lengthening into giant spindly forms across the earth. Donkeys, sensing the approach of their evening fodder, shifted lazily in their shaded enclosures, their hooves making a dull, dusty sound against the packed silt. The date palms that provided a canopy for the village cast long layered shadows that fell in intricate, feathery patterns across the mud brick walls, creating a world of geometric dark and gold. Behind the houses, the massive limestone cliffs were undergoing a final, dramatic transformation. The cooling stone caught the last, most angled light of the descending sun, turning from a dusty cream to a vibrant, glowing amber that seemed to pulse with an internal fire. The river, meanwhile, had begun its own retreat into the night, the surface darkening from a brilliant turquoise into a deep, somber navy, its ripples catching the last of the light in brief, golden flashes. The transition into the true golden hour was a slow, atmospheric deepening. The sun began to lower itself toward the jagged line of the western desert, and as it did, the light softened even further, losing its sharp white edge and becoming a saturated, liquid honey that coated everything it touched. The shadows stretched to their absolute limit, reaching out from the cliffs and the houses to touch the water, weaving a web of darkness that signaled the end of the day's labor. The sounds of the environment underwent a parallel shift. The high-pitched bird calls of the afternoon were replaced by the first low, rhythmic drone of insects emerging from the marshes, a consistent vibration that seemed to emanate from the cooling earth itself. In the distance, the last of the river birds were settling into the papyrus thickets, their occasional rustling and low croaks providing a quiet punctuation to the stillness. At the very edge of the landing, the faint, rhythmic splash of someone washing their hands in the Nile provided a human heartbeat to the scene. The sound of water on skin carrying clearly through the calm air. The conversation among the villagers had dropped in volume, becoming a quieter, more intimate murmur that spoke of rest and the gathering of the family unit. The narration of the landscape moved with the breath of the river, shifting focus between the village and the boat with a slow, contemplative ease. Midway through this hour, the sun touched the edge of the western horizon, and for a few profound moments, the world was suspended in a state of absolute, shimmering gold. The sky directly above the cliffs shifted from a deep amber to a muted, dusty rose, while high in the vault the first hint of indigo began to bleed in from the east. The limestone cliffs, having reached their peak of radiance, began to lose their brightness from the bottom up, as the shadow of the earth rose to claim them. The focus drifted naturally back toward the cedar vessel, which now rested in total stillness at the quay. The great sail had been lowered and neatly secured to the boom, its heavy linen folds appearing as a pale, ghostly mass in the fading light. The mast, once a dancing line against the clouds, was now a sharp, dark silhouette against the warming sky, its tip pointing toward the emerging mysteries of the evening. The hull of the boat, still wet from the journey, reflected the long streaks of amber light that danced on the surface of the river, while the clay jars on deck caught the final, horizontal rays of the sun, glowing softly like lanterns before the light finally failed. The sunset occurred not as an event, but as a slow, inevitable surrender. The sun dipped behind the western cliffs, and the moment it disappeared, the quality of the air changed instantly. A new, crisp coolness began to roll off the desert sands, chasing away the last of the day's radiant heat and carrying the smell of the river even further inland. The smoke from the hearths, no longer buffeted by the afternoon breeze, began to rise in straight, unwavering columns into the calm, purple sky, appearing as dark threads against the fading rose of the west. The silence deepened, becoming thick and textured, as if the world were holding its breath between the breath of the sun and the breath of the moon. In the east, the indigo was no longer a hint, but a reality, a vast, dark curtain that was slowly being drawn across the heavens. The limestone cliffs were now a ghostly, pale violet, their sharp edges beginning to blur into the darkening sky. The settlement had settled fully into the hour of dusk, the mud brick walls losing their definition and becoming part of the general landscape of shadow. The river was now a dark, silent road, its surface appearing like polished obsidian, reflecting nothing but the deepening violet of the sky and the very first, most hesitant stars that were just beginning to think about appearing in the highest part of the vault. The air was full of the scent of damp earth, cooling stone, and the distant sweet perfume of night-blooming jasmine that lived in the hidden gardens of the village. There was no haste in this transition, only a steady, rhythmic progression into the stillness of the evening. The boat, the village, and the cliffs were all united in this moment of quietude, a shared pause in the eternal flow of the Nile. The final remnants of the day's warmth still lingered in the stones of the landing, a small, grounding comfort as the night air grew more pronounced. The first faint twinkles of light began to manifest in the eastern quarter, not yet bright enough to cast a shadow, but sufficient to remind the watchers that the day was truly over. The world felt ancient, protected, and deeply at peace, held in the cradle of the river and the stone. The boat remained a silent, steady sanctuary at the edge of the water, its cedar planks cooling, its journey paused, its spirit waiting for the starlight to guide it once more. The sky continued its slow, beautiful transition, the rose fading into violet, the violet into indigo, and the indigo into the deep velvet black of the Egyptian night. The settlement was now a collection of warm, flickering lights as oil lamps were lit within the homes, casting small, orange glows through the doorways and onto the dusty ground. The journey of the day had reached its natural resting point, and the silence that followed was full of the wisdom of the water and the permanence of the land. The last of the amber tones finally dissolved into a muted purple, a transition so subtle it felt as though the atmosphere itself were a thinning veil, being pulled back to reveal the ancient and eternal depths of the cosmos. In the western sky, the jagged silhouette of the limestone cliffs, which had burned with such intensity only an hour ago, was now a soft, charcoal edge against a horizon that pulsed with a lingering, ghostly violet. To the east, the world had already surrendered to the indigo, a vast and deepening blue that seemed to pull the humidity from the river and the heat from the sands, creating a sharp, crisp cooling in the air. This shift in temperature brought with it an intensification of the river's scent, a thick, mineral-rich fragrance of damp silt, crushed papyrus, and the life-giving water that had travelled through the heart of the continent. The first visible star appeared with a sudden, crystalline clarity in the high vault of the sky, a solitary point of silver that signalled the true commencement of the night. On the shore, the small riverside settlement was undergoing its own quiet transformation, as the domestic rhythms of the day yielded to the intimate enclosure of the evening. Within the mud-brick homes, oil lamps were being lit, their small, flickering flames casting a warm, golden glow through the narrow doorways and onto the dusty ground of the courtyards. This light, fueled by linseed or castor oil, was soft and living, dancing against the textured surfaces of the walls and catching the edges of stored grain jars and woven baskets. From the deck of the cedar vessel, these lights appeared as grounded stars, echoing the celestial display beginning above. Thin strands of smoke from the final hearth fires rose perfectly straight into the still, heavy air appearing as dark vertical lines against the darkening sky. The darkness spread across the water like a physical substance, a liquid shadow that began at the edges of the reeds and flowed outward until the entire breadth of the Nile was a dark, shimmering expanse. The boat, now firmly secured at the landing area, rested in the near-still water of the bank's lee, its hull rising and falling with an almost imperceptible rhythm that was felt more than seen. Small ripples, born from the river's tireless progress in the travelled inward to brush against the cedar planks, each one catching a faint glint of the emerging starlight before dissolving back into the blackness. The ropes of twisted palm fibre held steady against the wooden posts of the dock, their tension a silent reminder of the vessel's weight and the river's persistent nudge. The sail had been tied down with meticulous care, its heavy linen folds now a dark, silent mass that no longer sought the wind, its purpose fulfilled for the day. Near the base of the mast, the clay jars were cooling rapidly, their porous surfaces shedding the last of the afternoon's warmth and becoming damp with the night's condensation, the water within settling into a cold, sweet clarity. As the minutes passed, the sky was revealed in its full, staggering majesty, a sight that defined the spiritual and physical orientation of the new kingdom. The Milky Way began to manifest as a pale, shimmering celestial river, a ghost-white path of light that arched from horizon to horizon, mirrored perfectly by the dark flow of the Nile below. To the watchers on deck, this was the heavenly counterpart to the earthly stream, the path upon which the gods moved in their eternal cycles. Sothis, the brilliant star Sirius, rose with a fierce blue-white fire. Its light so potent it seemed to cast a faint, silvery shadow across the deck. Orion, the great hunter and the celestial manifestation of Osiris, began his climb into the southern sky, his belt stars glowing with a cold, steady intensity that watched over the valley. The constellations were not distant, abstract points to those on the vessel. They were the eternal forms of the divine, the map of the devote, and the indicators of the seasons that governed the rising of the flood. Ra had now fully entered the hidden realms beneath the earth, his sunbark moving through the hours of darkness to face the trials of the night, while his light remained reflected in the silver points above. The sense that the sky and the river were two halves of a single, divine whole became a visceral reality in the absolute stillness of the hour. The sounds of the night began to fill the void left by the departure of the sun, a delicate and layered soundscape that was as textured as the landscape itself. In the thickets of papyrus and the marshy edges of the bank, the crickets began their rhythmic, high-pitched chirping, a sound that seemed to pulse in time with the flickering of the stars. From the deeper shadows of the reeds, the low, melodic croaking of frogs rose in a steady chorus, punctuated by the occasional, sudden splash of a river creature or the rustle of a nocturnal bird settling into its nest. In the far distance, perhaps from the high desert plateau beyond the cliffs, the lonely, echoing call of a jackal carried through the clear air, a reminder of the wild, unpeopled spaces that bordered the thin green line of the valley. Closer at hand, the soft, rhythmic sound of the water brushing against the limestone steps of the quay provided a grounding bass note to the evening. The human sounds of the settlement were fading now, reduced to the quietest of murmurs from within the homes and the occasional distant clink of a ceramic bowl. The world was narrowing down to the immediate, the intimate, and the safe. Full darkness had settled over the land, and with it came a pacing that was even slower and more meditative than the hours of the afternoon. The air on the skin was now distinctly cool, a refreshing contrast to the memory of the sun's heat that still lived within the grain of the wooden deck and the stones of the landing. The scent of the night was dominated by the smell of damp silt and the green, vegetal fragrance of the river plants, sharpened by the crispness of the cooling desert. One could feel the texture of the woven grass mats on the deck, their fibers yielding slightly, providing a soft and organic surface upon which to rest and observe the heavens. The cedar planks were finally releasing the last of the day's energy, a faint, resonant warmth that seeped upward through the mats. The sensory focus of the narration drew inward, concentrating on the small, protected space of the resting vessel. The stars now dominated the world entirely, their light so abundant that the Nile appeared not as a black void, but as a path of polished obsidian scattered with 1,000 points of silver mercury. Every ripple on the water was a liquid diamond, and the shadow of the mast reached out across the surface like a dark finger pointing toward the mysteries of the deep night. The vessel was a silent sanctuary, a world of wood and rope and linen that was part of the river's history and the land's permanence. There was no sense of hurry, no movement toward the dawn, only the absolute immersion in the present moment of the night. The settlement was fully quiet now, the oil lamps having been extinguished one by one until only the starlight and the faint, dying glow of a communal ember remained. The great river continued its tireless, invisible journey toward the sea, its power hidden beneath a surface of deceptive calm, carrying the silt of the south and the stories of the gods toward the northern horizon. The boat rested, a part of the landscape's long and storied life, held in the cradle of the water and the gaze of the eternal stars. The air was full of the spirit of the evening, a deep and profound peace that was both ancient and new, a testament to the enduring rhythm of the new kingdom. The sky was a jeweled vault, the river a dark mirror, and the land a silent witness to the passage of time. Every breath taken in this stillness was a communion with the elements, the water, the stone, and the air. The boat remained a steady, unmoving presence at the edge of the world, its cedar planks cooling. Its journey paused in the heart of the Egyptian night. The darkness was not empty, but full of the potential of the coming hours, a time for rest and for the silent movement of the stars. The silhouette of the limestone cliffs remained a constant, protective wall in the distance, their jagged peaks lost in the velvet blackness of the sky. The journey had reached a place of total equilibrium, a moment where the flow of the river and the stillness of the land were perfectly balanced under the watch of Sothis and the Milky Way. The silence was thick, textured, and deeply comforting, a cocoon of sound that wrapped around the vessel and its sleepers. The world was at rest, but the river never slept, its current a constant, low-frequency hum that vibrated through the hull and into the soul of the traveller. The starlight danced on the water, a silent music of light that required no audience but the night itself. The boat was a vessel of memory, carrying the light of the day into the depths of the night, waiting for the eventual return of Ra while honoring the beauty of his absence. The air grew even colder as the midnight hour approached, but the enclosure of the boat remained a place of warmth and security, protected by the gods and the strength of the cedar. The stars seemed to descend, drawing closer to the earth until it felt as though one could reach out and touch the silver fire of the constellations. The great celestial river continued its slow rotation above, a silent, swirling mystery that reflected the order of the cosmos and the stability of the kingdom. The night was a gift, a time of profound and unhurried observation, a surrender to the ancient and predictable flow of the world. The sky over the Nile had now reached its most profound and absolute depth, a vast canopy of black-blue velvet that seemed to stretch into the very origins of the cosmos. The stars, stripped of any competition from the sun's lingering glow, burned with a sharp, unwavering intensity, their light piercing the dry Egyptian air like crystalline fires. High above the mast of the cedar vessel, the Milky Way was no longer a mere smudge of light, but a brilliant, defined celestial river, a glowing road of stardust that arched from the southern horizon to the north, its intricate clusters and dark rifts mirroring the winding path of the Nile below. Every constellation was etched into the darkness with a clarity that made the heavens feel close enough to touch. The great Tsar, known to later ages as Orion, climbed steadily toward the zenith, his belt stars shining with a cold, regal silver that cast a ghostlight across the deck. Beneath this staggering display, the river was a dark mirror of polished obsidian, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple that transformed the reflection of a star into a momentary streak of liquid mercury. The settlement on the bank had fallen into a state of total, heavy slumber, its mud brick forms merging into the shadow of the limestone cliffs until the village was nothing more than a series of soft, geometric silhouettes against the starlight. The fires had long since died into grey ash, and the oil lamps were extinguished, leaving the world to the governance of the night and the silent movement of the stars. In this suspended centre of the night, time itself seemed to have slowed to a rhythmic pulse, a pace set not by the frantic movements of the day, but by the steady, unhurried flow of the water toward the northern sea. The boat, secured by its palm fibre ropes to the stone quay, barely shifted in the current, It was an almost imperceptible movement, a slow, gentle heave that felt like the breathing of the river itself. The ropes, taut and secure, would occasionally tighten and then relax with a soft, organic creak, a sound that was both comforting and grounding in the immense silence. As the air continued to cool, the cedar and sycamore planks of the vessel's construction contracted with tiny, musical ticks, a chorus of wooden whispers that spoke of the ship's resilience and its history. The clay jars near the mast were now cold to the touch, their surfaces slick with the heavy condensation of the midnight hour, the water within having settled into a deep, refreshing chill that held the mineral essence of the mountains far to the south. The soundscape of the deep night was one of delicate, isolated events rather than a continuous drone. From the thickets of papyrus that crowded the bank, a single owl let out a low, hollow call that echoed briefly against the face of the limestone cliffs before being swallowed by the stillness. Somewhere in the dark water, a large fish disturbed the surface with a sudden, wet splash, sending a series of concentric silver rings outward to meet the hull. A brief interruption that only served to emphasize the profound quiet that followed. The water touching the stone steps of the landing did so in rhythmic, predictable intervals, a soft, percussive lap that sounded like the ticking of a liquid clock. In the marshes, the tall reeds rustled with the faintest of breaths, a dry, papyrus-like whisper that moved through the darkness as if the earth were dreaming aloud. To the mind of a traveler in the New Kingdom, this was not merely an absence of light, but the presence of the Dawat, the unseen realm beneath the horizon where the sunbark of Ra made its nightly journey through the 12 hours of darkness. The stars above were the Ikimusek, the followers of the gods, eternal and unchanging beings who watched over the world while the sun fought its battles in the underworld. The sky was the great celestial river, the heavenly Nile, and the vessel resting at the quay was part of a grand, symmetrical universe where every ripple on the water and every spark in the sky were inextricably linked. The darkness was not a place of fear but a sacred space of transition and protection, a time when the world was renewed and the forces of Mat were reaffirmed in the silence. The narration of the night slowed even further, focusing on the minute textures that defined the vessel's interior world. In the brilliance of the starlight, the fine grain of the cedar deck was visible, the silver light highlighting the natural whorls and knots of the wood. A faint sheen of dew began to form over the woven grass mats, making them feel cool and slightly damp, their organic scent of dried field grass mixing with the smell of the river's silt. The air near the water's edge had grown cold enough that the breath of a watcher would appear for a fleeting moment as a tiny, translucent cloud, a brief manifestation of life in the still center of the night. Long passages of descriptive silence seemed to linger over the deck, reflecting the way the shadows of the rigging didn't move, held in place by the unwavering light of the high stars. The smell of the river had become more pronounced, a thick, mineral-heavy fragrance of wet mud and ancient water that had been filtered through the sands of time. Every detail was a study in stillness, the way a drop of condensation hung from the rim of a water jar, the way the linen canopy was pulled tight and motionless against its poles, and the way the shadows of the village houses reached out into the water like dark fingers. There was no sense of hurry, no pressure for the sun to rise, only the deep and absolute immersion in the midnight hour. The boat felt like a world unto itself, a small, cedar-walled sanctuary held in the palm of the Nile, safe and sound beneath the gaze of the celestial hunter and the mother goddess of the stars. As the hours progressed toward the final third of the night, an almost imperceptible shift began to occur in the balance of the world. It was not a change in the light. The sky remained a deep, velvet black blue, and the shadows were as dark as ever, but a change in the position of the heavens. The great constellation of Sar had climbed past its zenith and begun its slow, majestic tilt toward the western horizon, and the stars of the eastern quarter seemed to have shifted their orientation, revealing new clusters of light that had been hidden by the curve of the earth. Orion was higher now, his sword and belt a sharp, brilliant configuration that seemed to dominate the southern sky. Far to the east, beyond the darkened silhouettes of the palm groves and the distant desert hills, there was a subtle, ghostly paling of the atmosphere. Not yet a color, not yet a light, but a thinning of the darkness that suggested the night had passed its deepest point. This was the moment when the world was at its most quiet, the transition between the absolute night and the first, hesitant thoughts of the dawn. The river continued to flow, a dark and silent power moving through the heart of the kingdom. Its current a constant, low-frequency hum that could be felt through the hull of the boat. The vessel remained moored, its ropes holding steady, its wood continuing to tick and whisper in the cool air. The silence was so thick it felt textured, a blanket of sound that wrapped around the settlement and the river, protecting the sleepers and the watchers alike. Every breath taken in this stillness was a communion with the ancient rhythm of the land, a surrender to the flow of the Nile and the movement of the stars. The sky remained immense and ancient, a map of the divine that had been read by priests and sailors for 1,000 years. The boat, the village, and the cliffs were all part of this grand, slow motion, transit through the darkness, a journey that didn't require movement to be profound. The texture of the night was one of cool stone, damp wood, and silver fire. A world stripped of the complexities of the day and returned to its elemental truths. The faint sheen of the dew on the cedar rail caught the light of Sothis, creating a single brilliant spark that seemed to hold the entire energy of the cosmos in its small, liquid frame. The world was waiting, but it was not waiting in haste. It was resting in the absolute certainty of the cycle, the knowledge that Ra would emerge from the Duat, and that the river would continue to rise and fall as it always had. The darkness was a gift of rest, a time of profound and unhurried observation. The smell of the river water was at its most potent now, a deep, earthy scent that carried the story of the whole land, from the high cataracts to the broad marshes of the north. The boat was a silent participant in this story, its planks holding the memories of the morning sun and the evening's incense, now cooling under the influence of the midnight stars. The final paragraphs of the night were written in the shifting positions of the constellations and the gradual cooling of the air. The world felt smaller and more enclosed, a private sanctuary of starlight and water where the only movement was the pulse of the river and the silent rotation of the heavens. The mast silhouette reached up toward the Milky Way, a dark needle pointing toward the heart of the galaxy, and the whole reflected the silver points of light in a way that made the vessel appear as if it were floating in the sky itself. The settlement remained a collection of shadows, its mud brick walls holding the silence of the generations, its people dreaming of the fields and the flood. The journey was held in a state of perfect equilibrium, a moment of absolute peace that felt as though it could last forever. The stars were sharp and unwavering, their light a constant reminder of the permanence of the gods and the stability of the kingdom. The earliest suggestion of the coming change was not a light, but a feeling, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the weight of the air as the deepest indigo of the night began to lose its absolute density. In the far east, beyond the jagged silhouettes of the palm groves and the silent, limestone heights, a pale, charcoal-grey line began to stretch along the horizon, slowly dissolving the sharp boundaries between the earth and the heavens. The stars, which had reigned over the valley with such crystalline authority throughout the long hours of the midnight watch, began to dim one by one, their fierce silver fire softening into a quiet, spectral white. The great celestial river of the Milky Way, once a brilliant road of stardust, started to fade into the deepening vault, receding like a tide as the atmosphere thickened with the approach of a new day. This was the hour of profound stillness, the moment of transition where the world held its breath in the sharp, crisp chill that always precedes the sun. The air near the water's edge had grown cold and invigorating, carrying the scent of damp earth and the heavy, mineral fragrance of the river with a renewed intensity. The Nile itself remained a dark, secretive expanse, but it was no longer the obsidian void of the midnight hour. It was slowly gaining a soft, metallic definition, its surface appearing like brushed lead as it caught the first reflected traces of the thinning darkness. Along the horizon, the silver line sharpened and expanded, bleeding into a soft, bruised violet and then into a translucent saffron that began to wash over the eastern bank. The limestone cliffs, those ancient witnesses to the passage of time, were the first to greet the change, their highest peaks catching a ghostlight that turned the stone into a pale, glowing ivory, while the valleys below remained steeped in the blue shadows of the dying night. As the light strengthened, the river underwent a transformation of color, shifting from its nocturnal black into a deep, regal navy that pulsed with the movement of the undercurrent. Small ripples began to sparkle with the first true colors of the morning, flecks of rose and pale gold that danced across the water like scattered jewels. Along the shore, the natural world began its quiet, rhythmic awakening. A single ibis took flight from the papyrus thicket, its white wings appearing like a flicker of flame against the grey sky, and the first tentative notes of a songbird rose from the acacia trees, a sound that was soon joined by the low, melodic croak of herons stirring in the shallows. Within the small settlement, the human rhythm returned with equal gentleness. A thin, vertical strand of blue smoke rose from a domestic hearth, signaling the revival of the morning fire, and the soft, muffled sound of a mud brick door opening on wooden hinges carried clearly across the water. Early footsteps, light and unhurried, could be heard on the packed earth of the courtyard, followed by the rhythmic, metallic clink of a water jar being set down near the landing. There was no haste in these movements, only the steady, predictable preparation for a life dictated by the sun and the river. On the cedar vessel, the crew began the familiar rituals of departure, their movements as fluid and silent as the water itself. The palm fiber ropes, which had held the boat in its nocturnal sanctuary, were loosened from the stone posts with a soft, rasping sound, the braided coils falling onto the deck with a resonant thud, with a gentle, coordinated push from the sycamore poles. The vessel moved away from the bank, the gap between the hull and the shore widening as the boat surrendered itself once more to the Nile's embrace. There was a slight, graceful shudder as the hull found the main channel, a sensation of being reclaimed by a power far greater than any man-made anchor. The northern breeze, fresh and cool, arrived with the rising light, and as the great linen sail was unfurled, it caught the wind with a soft, resonant swell, the fabric stretching tight and humming with the energy of the morning. The vessel glided back into the current, its path as certain as the rising of the sun, moving with an effortless grace that felt like the continuation of an eternal conversation between the wood and the water. The light was now clear and pure, a radiant, unfolding brilliance that filled the valley with a sense of quiet renewal. As the boat moved further into the stream, the sky transformed into a vast, unclouded canopy of copper and gold, echoing the very first light that had greeted the start of this journey. Yet the atmosphere now felt different, heavier with experience, more settled in its peace. The reeds along the bank nodded in the morning breeze, their green heads shimmering with the last of the night's dew, and the distant irrigation canals began to sparkle like silver threads across the black land. The river stretched ahead into an open, shimmering distance, a dark and life-giving road that wound through the heart of the kingdom toward horizons yet unseen. The perspective of the journey began to widen, the boat becoming a small but purposeful part of a much larger, grander landscape. The limestone cliffs receded into a soft, hazy blue, their monumental forms standing as a backdrop to the vibrant green of the cultivation and the golden reach of the desert beyond. The rhythm of the water against the bow was steady and eternal, a constant, low-frequency song that spoke of the stability of the land and the permanence of the river. Every detail, the scent of the warming silt, the texture of the linen canopy, the play of light on the cedar planks felt like a completed thought, a thread woven into a tapestry that spanned the entire history of the Kemet. There was no need for summary or reflection, for the atmosphere itself carried the weight of the miles traveled and the hours observed. The vessel was carried forward not just by the wind and the current, but by the momentum of a world that never truly stopped, even when it rested. The morning light had now reached its full, clarifying strength, washing over the valley and turning the Nile into a molten path of gold that seemed to lead directly into the heart of the day. The farmers were back in the fields, the shadoofs were beginning their rhythmic creak, and the smoke of 100 villages rose into the clear, sapphire sky. The journey felt expansive and timeless, a movement that existed outside the narrow confines of hours and minutes, rooted instead in the ancient and predictable cycles of the flood and the sun. The boat continued its glide, a silent traveler in a land of light and stone, moving toward the next bend in the river with a grace that was both humble and majestic. The sky opened fully, a brilliant, limitless expanse that held the promise of the afternoon heat and the eventual return of the stars, while below, the Nile flowed with a power that was as silent as it was absolute. The final miles of this shared transit were written in the shimmering haze of the horizon and the steady, unhurried pulse of the current. The world was whole, the balance was restored, and the river remained the thread that bound the gods, the people, and the earth into a single, shimmering embrace. The boat, with its crew of silent watchers and its cargo of memories, moved deeper into the frame of the morning, becoming a part of the landscape's long and storied life, a fleck of cedar and linen on the breast of the eternal river. As the shorelines softened into the distance and the light became a brilliant, all-encompassing presence, the sense of completion was absolute, yet the journey itself suggested no end. It was merely a transition into another phase of the river's life, a forward motion that would continue long after the eyes had turned away. The Nile stretched forward, vast and unwavering, carrying the vessel into the shimmering mystery of the unfolding day, a testament to the enduring spirit of the new kingdom and the timeless peace of the water. The air was full of the scent of blooming acacia and the dry dust of the desert, a final, sensory blessing from the land of the pharaohs. The rhythm of the oars, the creak of the rudder, and the soft hiss of the wake provided the final notes to a symphony of movement that had no beginning and would have no end. The boat sailed on, a steady and tranquil presence in the golden heart of the morning, drifting ever forward into the light, while the river, ancient and eternal, moved beneath it toward the sea, carrying the story of the Nile into the quiet, expansive brilliance of the new day.